Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for tuning in tonight to join us to talk about aquatic invasive species, in particular to Lake Simcoe, but obviously many of these aquatic invasive species find themselves in a number of inland water bodies, including the Great Lakes in Southern Ontario. So all this information is pertinent to basically everybody on the line here, no matter where you find yourself. And then following that, we will be talking about the new boater regulations, and then we'll be hopefully having some time at the end for some Q&A. So the agenda for this evening, so who is the ISAP? So the Invasive Species Awareness Program, I'm with the Invasive Species Awareness Program, and so is Matt. And what is the Water Steward Program? And then we'll be talking about aquatic invasive species profiles, followed by the new boater regulations, and then we'll be jumping into that question and answer period, like I mentioned before. So my name is Brooke Schreier. I am the Aquatic Program Specialist with the Invasive Species Awareness Program and the Ontario Federation of Irish Hunters. I've been with ISAP for 6 years now, give or take. And I've worn a number of different caps, but my focus has always been in aquatics, primarily. Within the last year, I am coordinating the wild pig surveillance program. So that is another initiative that we're running out of ISAP, trying to keep wild pigs off our landscapes in Ontario. But fundamentally, my job's always really been wrapped up in education outreach, reaching out to folks all across the province, raising the profile for various aquatic invasive species, making sure that guys and gals on the water know what to look for. If they see something that's suspicious, that they know the protocols and how to take a photograph, how to report it to us so we can get that information to those who need to know. So that's basically what I do. I run EdMaps, which is our early detection and distribution mapping system. If you've never heard of that, it's a tracking database that we use. I also facilitate the invading species hotline and just really oversee most things aquatics, hence why I'm chatting with you folks tonight. That being said, I'll pass it over to Matt.
Hey everybody, great to see a lot of the same names that I saw a couple weeks ago. We had our first Lake Simcoe webinar. So once again, for those of you who are new, my name is Matt Robbins. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Outreach Liaison with ISAP. And so primarily what I focus on is something called the Water Steward Program, where we sort of engage with boaters and watercraft users. And then I also work on a number of different projects in ISAP, including, I worked with Brooke on the Wild Pig Surveillance Program and things like that.
Real quick, I just see somebody mentioning that they have no sound. Denise, if you don't have any sound, I would recommend that you close the meeting and then try to rejoin, and then just check to see, or she probably can't even hear me. So maybe I'll just type the answer. I'm brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide here. I'll pass it over to you, Jeremy, and then you, Brenda, to introduce yourselves to the group.
Doesn't look like my video is going to work here. I don't know. So I think
that's okay.
Anyway, yeah, so I'm Jeremy Down. I'm a Senior Invasive Species Policy and Program Advisor with Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry. Nice long name these days. So I'm the policy advisor that's responsible for the Invasive Species Act and the associated regulations. So I led the drafting of the new watercraft regulation that we'll be talking about tonight. And Brenda.
Well, hi there, folks. I'm sorry, my video also will not work. I think it's just a setting that we haven't figured out. But anyways, welcome everyone. It's nice to be involved in another of these presentations again. I'm a provincial enforcement specialist with the NDMNRF with enforcement branch, and work pretty closely with Jeremy and also with Brooke and Matt on the invasive species front. My portfolio is fisheries and invasive species. There's quite an interconnection between those two. And as a provincial enforcement specialist, part of our role is advising field officers on some of the elements of the rules, some of the finer points or questions that they have, and working with a policy section in terms of what the intent of those rules are. So happy to be participating again tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, and before we really jump into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, I just want to extend a thank you to both of you for being here, and obviously a thank you to everybody who's tuning in. So before we jump into these invasive species profiles, I want to give you some context around who we are. I saw a question already. What does the ISAP acronym stand for? And it is the Invading Species Awareness Program. So the Invasive Species Awareness Program is one of the 4 conservation programs out of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. And the OFAH, for short, is the largest nonprofit charitable fish and wildlife conservation organization in Ontario. Been around for almost 100 years, and really focuses as an organization on the protection of our fishing, hunting, and trapping heritage, as well as trying to enhance opportunities for those groups. We promote and encourage safe and responsible participation. And finally, we champion the conservation of Ontario's fish and wildlife resources. So we really act as the voice of anglers and hunters in Ontario. Then the ISAP, or the Invasive Species Awareness Program, like I said, is one of those 4 conservation programs. It's been around since 1992, when it was created in partnership between the OFAH and the ND-MNRF, or what was once the MNR back in those days. And our program has been around for 30 years now, and we've really focused on educating Ontario's public about invasive species, being a conduit between us and the government for reporting invasive species via the Invading Species Hotline, which is 1-800-563-7711. You can call Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. We also host all of the tracking information for the province or for Ontario through EdMaps, as I mentioned before, as well as an iNaturalist project. So, if you guys are looking to report invasive species or even receive additional information on invasive species, you can go to one of those 3 things, either iNaturalist, EdMaps, or give us a call on the hotline Monday to Friday. Beyond that, focusing on those key pathways of introduction and spread of those invasive species, both aquatic and terrestrial in nature. So we oftentimes, through our program, try to engage with various groups who are known to be vectors of spread. And in tonight's presentation, we're focusing on boaters, because obviously boating is one of those vectors of spread. So that could be waterfowl hunters, that could be hikers, that could be ATVers. Regardless of who you are, if you're on the landscape and you're engaging with Ontario's nature, you're most likely at risk of spreading invasive species, be they aquatic or terrestrial. So we try to make sure that people know what to look for when they're out in the landscape to try to prevent the spread of these invasive species. I already mentioned our monitoring and early detection work through the Invasive Species Hotline and EdMaps, but we also support surveillance, control, and response of various invasive species. So top of mind is Water Soldier. So Rob McGowan, who's listening in, is our management technician, who for the last number of years has been working to monitor for Water Soldier in the Trent Severn Waterway, as well as other areas throughout the province when they pop up, and working towards the eradication of that species in the TSW. Then we have the Mystery Snail Management and Removal Program. I actually have some mystery snails right beside me in a fish tank that was actually removed from Ontario's waters this past summer. And as part of that program, in our pilot year in 2021, we removed over 560,000 mystery snails. And that is a profile, both banded and Chinese mystery snails, that Matt will be talking about shortly. Then I mentioned the Wild Pig Surveillance Program. That's another program that we run where we get trail cameras out to users on the landscape and try to get eyes in the woods and on the fields looking for any occurrences of wild pigs, so that if they do appear, we can get those reports to ND-MNRF so that they can get out there hopefully and get those pigs off the landscape. Then finally, early detection of Asian carps. That's a big one. Through EdMaps, the hotline, et cetera, we facilitate receiving Asian carps reports. And then we have protocols in place to pass all that information along to ND-MNRF and to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or DFO, to ensure that if a fish is caught or grass carp is caught, that there's folks on the water trying to get those fish out. So it's always good to start with some context. And I always like to define what an aquatic invasive species is, because people tend to kind of get it mixed up at times with alien species. So I wanted to start with that. And obviously, when we're talking about aquatic invasive species or terrestrial invasive species, we're talking about species which are outside of their natural past or present distribution, right? They were introduced to a new ecosystem where they didn't evolve, they weren't here naturally, and are now starting to have severe impacts on either our economy, our environment, or society, including human health. So, the photo you see here is a photo of a round goby, which is a species that finds itself in Lake Simcoe, as well as each of the Great Lakes and a few other inland lakes in Ontario, and has quite a voracious appetite and can really impact our native fish species. So, that's what invasive species are. Now, in contrast to alien species, I use this kind of synonymously with non-native or non-indigenous species. Now, these are the ones that, were brought here and didn't necessarily, evolve here or weren't here naturally, but that we introduced and aren't necessarily having those same impacts on, the environment or economy or society. So one has the severe impacts, the other does not. And sometimes the impacts can get a little bit murky. It depends on who you ask. But by and large, when we're talking about invasive species, they're the ones that are really having those detrimental impacts. So then when we talk about pathways and vectors of spread, again, I use that synonymously, and it's how these invasive species have gotten from point A to point B, right? So whether it's in the ballast water of a seafaring ship, or whether it's in pallets of a aircraft, a cargo plane coming across, or it's on somebody's propeller on their boat, or in their bait bucket. These are all pathways or vectors of spread for AIS as well as TIS, terrestrial invasive species. That being said, there are a number of natural pathways for invasive species, and the photo you see here is Phragmites, and I'm sure many of you, especially if you're in Southern Ontario, are quite familiar with Phragmites, which is a riparian plant species that's quite invasive. And this is a plant that can spread via its rhizomes or via its seeds. So obviously, there's many species who spread naturally once they're here. And then finally, man-made pathways, ice angling, bait buckets, props, all those things I mentioned before are vectors of spread for invasive species. And really the reason why we're chatting with you folks here tonight. So with that being said, I'm going to sign off for talking for now, and I'm going to pass it over to Matt to lead us through the rest of the presentation, more or less.
Thanks, Brooke. As Brooke has said, the primary focus today is the boater pathway. There's a lot of different ways that an aquatic invasive species spread, but that's the focus today. And as such, we're going to be we're talking about species that are sort of more relevant to watercraft use than, say, some of the species we talked about in our first webinar, which focused on bait buckets and bait of various kinds. There will be a little bit of overlap for those of you who were here for the last webinar, but we'll also be talking about some different species as well. And completely today, we're going to be talking about species that are currently in Lake Simcoe. So the first thing to start off with, I think, is just a very common species, one I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that's Eurasian Watermilfoil. It's a very prolific aquatic invasive species across Southern Ontario, unfortunately. And it was first detected in Lake Simcoe in 2004. Primarily, it gets around through recreational boating and subsequent equipment. A really key characteristic of Eurasian Watermilfoil is that it can reproduce through fragmentation. And what that means is that a small piece of the plant that gets broken off or torn off can actually free float for long periods of time, survive, and then sprout roots later on and reestablish itself. And so that makes recreational boating pretty problematic in a lot of ways, because we've got propellers going through vegetation all the time, spreading this stuff. You get a little piece on your boat or your trailer, and you take it to a new place, and all of a sudden it can sprout out, sprout up from there. It doesn't have to have roots. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to use seeds necessarily. So yeah, generally, it's a shallow water plant, and that means, sort of 1 to 3 meters, but it actually has been known to root up to 10 meters deep. And in terms of just recognizing the plant, it sort of has these feather-like green leaves that encircle a main stem, as you can see in the pictures here. It's important to note that these tend to be in groups of 4 or 5 on sort of encircling the stem. That's a key identifying feature in terms of distinguishing this plant from some other lookalikes. And then beyond that, there's also these tiny reddish flowers that grow on terminal spikes, as you can see on the far left image. And those actually rise out of the water in sort of late summer, August through September time of the year. But other than that, other than the spikes, it's a submerged plant. In terms of lookalikes, this plant is often confused with the native northern water milfoil. So we do have a native milfoil, as well as native coontail, and then it can also be confused with the invasive parrot feather. Next slide, please. Thanks, Brooke. So in terms of impacts, if, I'm considering all of our guests here, I'm assuming are boaters. I'm sure plenty of you are familiar with some of the implications of having Eurasian Watermilfoil in a water body. Overall, like many aquatic plants, or rather aquatic invasive plants, it's associated with reduced biodiversity. It competes aggressively with native plant species and sort of smothers them. It can actually reduce oxygen levels in a water body, largely because of mass decomposition. So when all the plants die at once, this can decrease the oxygen and cause fish die-offs. And then on top of that, this phenomenon can also increase eutrophication, which then can lead to algal blooms. On top of that, the obvious stuff, it creates these dense, thick mats that just make recreation very difficult, whether it's swimming or fishing or boating. And it actually can create stagnation in a water body. So if you've got dense enough plants where water's flowing, it can actually slow down the flow of water and in turn create sort of ideal habitat for mosquitoes and other insects like that. Next slide. Thank you. As you can see here, the distribution of Eurasian Watermilfoil is primarily, at least in terms of Ontario, in southern Ontario, and it kind of follows the contour of our primary urban centers, although there are a couple places that it sort of become outliers, particularly, I think that might be Timmins. So, yeah. So the next plant we're going to talk about is not a plant. It is actually a macroalgae. And so that is, it's the same thing that seaweed is. Very similar to a plant in a lot of ways, but technically not. So this is Starry Stonewort, and it's native to Eurasia. It was first detected in Lake Simcoe in 2009. Once again, it gets around easily through boating because you have these little pieces that we're going to talk about called bubles that if you spread them, they're tiny little pieces. If they get caught up in some gear or something like that, and they spread, they can easily cause reproduction that way in a new water body. Also, if for whatever reason somebody were to have these in an aquarium or pond overflow or a pond, there'd be concern there if people were to dump the contents of their aquarium or they had overflow or something like that. But primarily the concern is recreational boating from within Ontario, at least. So when you're looking to identify this particular organism, it's very unique looking. As you can see from the pictures, there's sort of a singular stem with these branchlets that shoot off on either side. And sometimes it's very thick, but other times it can be very thin and sort of transparent. And almost, people often compare it to fishing line, which you can kind of see on the bottom right image there. Beyond that, it has the white star-shaped bubles, as we call them, on the ends of the nodes, and hence the name. And those are fairly small, as you can see, them being compared to the penny. And they are, those are the primary means by which they reproduce. In terms of lookalikes, there are actually a number of native species here that do look a bit similar to this particular organism. So muskrats is a native species that looks a bit similar, and then there's also members of the Chara family. Next, thank you. In terms of impacts, it's a fairly similar story to milfoil. This organism forms very dense mats. They're actually sometimes called pillows, and they compete aggressively with native plants, and as well as, they really impede natural functions of aquatic ecosystems. So they make it difficult for phytoplankton and zooplankton and invertebrates to do their thing. And in turn, they have effects on the higher levels of the ecosystem. So native fish and even terrestrial species. They can also impede the spawning habits of fish directly. So fish might regularly use certain types of aquatic cover, but these mats are so dense that they can't use them, or they can't even hide in them for protection. So it has quite an impact that way. And like milfoil, they can restrict water flow and create issues with recreation. Next slide, please, Brooke. And yeah, so this is our current distribution in this part of Ontario. I wouldn't call it localized, but it's certainly less well distributed than Eurasian Watermilfoil so far. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Okay, so Brooke mentioned these earlier on because of the mystery snail removal program or project. So banded and Chinese mystery snails, they're two separate species, but we sort of just lump them together a little bit for the sake of messaging. These species are both in Lake Simcoe. Unfortunately, they've been around since the early 1900s, actually. Banded mystery snails are native to the southeastern United States, whereas Chinese mystery snails are native to Asia. And they can really, concerns for these particular organisms when it comes to their spread, it can be bait, so they can easily get in a bait bucket, or ballast water is a big one. So whether it's a large cargo ship or a small recreational boat, and then once again, as snails, they stick to things. So there's a concern when it comes to recreational boating and equipment. In terms of identifying these organisms, one of the biggest things is their size, and we're going to see in the next slide that illustrated a little bit better. The Chinese mystery snail, which by the way is on the right, so it's the sort of brownish to olive green snail. That snail tends to be 6.5 centimeters or less. You can get really big, whereas the banded mystery snail is generally 3.5 centimeters or less. And obviously they also have the bands, so they're sort of yellow to greenish brown in color with these 3 or 4 reddish to brown spiral bands. And both of these snails, importantly, have operculums, which are essentially sort of a trapdoor shell opening that allow them to survive in essentially unhospitable conditions or even out of water for longer periods of time. In terms of lookalikes, banded mystery snails are a little more distinctive, I think. They look sort of like a common white-lipped snail, but that is a terrestrial snail, and these are aquatic. When it comes to the Chinese mystery snail, though, they're often mixed up with great pond snails and pointed Campyloma. Next slide. Thank you. So you can see sort of the size difference more easily in these images. You've got the banded mystery snails on the left, and they're fairly small most of the time. And the Chinese mystery snails on the right, which are very big. And actually, I've seen a fair amount larger than this as well. So they get really, really big. In terms of their impacts, these snails are really effective invasive species. They reproduce and spread very quickly. They'll actually prey on fish eggs and ultimately reduce the survival rate and really the overall reproductive success of a number of sport fish and other important aquatic fish. They also outcompete native snails for food and habitat and have effects on their populations. They've also been known to spread parasites, including some of which can actually kill waterfowl. And beyond that, Chinese mystery snails have been known to clog up water intake pipes. So there's issues that way as well. We can go to distribution, thanks. Yeah, so now we have this, here's our basic distribution. They sort of exist in the Niagara River, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and quite a number of waterways in South and Central Ontario, including the Kawarthas and the Haliburton region. And so Brooke's project there, the mystery snail removal project, is focusing primarily at this point in the Haliburton area. Next slide. And this is distribution for Chinese mystery snails. All right, so for those of you who were here I want to say last week, but a couple of weeks ago, this will be one we've already discussed, zebra mussels. For those of you who weren't here, I'm sure you know about them as well. These are a very, certainly in our part of Ontario, they're very well known. So zebra mussels are a small freshwater bivalve. They're native to the Ponto-Caspian regions of Eurasia, and they were first actually recorded in Lake Simcoe in 1993. Probably, well, we're very confident that they were introduced in the ballast water of cargo ships, but nowadays the concern, at least for transportation within Ontario, is primarily about recreational boats and gear. That's especially because the larval stage of zebra mussels and other mussels like quagga mussels are actually so small you really can't see them. You can see an image of one on the top left here. They're called villagers. And although you can kind of feel them along the side of a boat, it feels sort of like sandpaper. You can't see them with the naked eye, so it makes it really problematic in terms of launching boats and gear and taking them out of water bodies and putting them in others, because they can very easily hop between systems that way. In terms of identifying these mussels, I think most people kind of know what to look for, but basically you have that sort of characteristic zigzag of sort of brownish to even black against a sort of off-white color on the shell or of the mussel. They do vary in color though. You can see there's sort of a darker one on the bottom right image. But the really key characteristic that distinguishes zebra mussels from other species of mussels, particularly quagga mussels, which also exist in Lake Simcoe, is the flat bottom. So you can see they have the flat bottom underneath here, and quagga mussels do not. Next slide. Zebra mussels are interesting because they have, they filter feed, and that means that the water it turns fairly nice, I think, in terms of aesthetics, at least. A lot of people like the effect that they have on water bodies, at least visually, because the water is nice and clear and blue and beautiful, but that comes at a cost. The reason that they change the clarity of the water is because they filter out phytoplankton, primarily algae, and that is a really important baseline for our aquatic ecosystems. It's the forage base for a lot of things, particularly zooplankton. And zooplankton are primary food source for a lot of fish species and other aquatic organisms. And then the sport fish that we love eat those fish. And so basically, when you reduce the number of phytoplankton and zooplankton in our system, you have a really significant cascading effect on the whole aquatic ecology in general. And so that's what happens generally when we introduce zebra mussels into an aquatic system. Ultimately, this also means reductions or even extirpations of native clam populations, which is a real problem. They also increase toxic algal blooms in some cases. Interestingly enough, they're picky eaters, so they will filter certain algae, but they will not accept blue-green algae, which is the toxic algae that causes algal blooms that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and it has plenty of problems associated with it. They'll actually spit out blue-green algae, and the result is a higher concentration of blue-green algae in the water body and more algal blooms. And then beyond that, of course, they're a biofouler. They clog things up. They cause issues with gear and such, and they are a significant bioaccumulator and pass contaminants up the food chain. And this is our distribution map for zebra mussels in Ontario. Once again, fairly common theme in terms of where they're distributed. It's generally around our more urban centers because they get around from us. So the next organism we're going to be talking about is an interesting one. It's not one we covered a couple of weeks ago, and those are spiny water fleas. So this is actually a predatory zooplankton, like what we were just talking about, that's native to Eurasia and was first detected in Lake Simcoe in 1993. In terms of pathways of spread. There's concern when it comes to shipping, like large cargo ships and such, ballast water, and recreational boating, angling equipment. As you can see here, they get stuck to fishing lines and things like that, and people dumping bait buckets. Those are all pathways that they can easily spread by. It's important to note that spiny water fleas can actually reproduce by cloning themselves, so they only need one female to reproduce in a new water body, and that's really significant. But beyond that, when conditions aren't right, they can actually produce something called resting eggs, which fall to the bottom of a water body or the bottom of your ballast or your bait bucket, and will hatch when conditions are favorable. And those eggs are really hardy, so they can be frozen, they can be dried out, and when exposed to water and the better conditions, they'll essentially come to life. So they're very, very difficult thing to deal with, and so it's really important that we do our best to control our potential pathways of spread. Next slide, please, Brooke. And the reason it's so important is because spiny water fleas have a really significant impact on, once again, that baseline ecology. So they cause a generally 30 to 40% drop in native zooplankton populations. And as I've just mentioned earlier, that is a bad thing for the ecosystem as a whole. You might also think that maybe, well, because they're zooplankton and they're reducing other zooplankton, that maybe they'll just fill in that gap. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way, because hence the name, they're very spiny, and it's very difficult for fish to consume them. And for that reason, they don't really fill in that forage base gap that they've created. Beyond that, they cause damage to commercial equipment, recreational angling equipment, and things like that. And here we have a distribution map for spiny water fleas, and you can see they've sort of have that a similar distribution to some of the other invasive species, except there's a lot more going on in northwestern Ontario as well. Next slide. All right, so those are just a few. Oh, how did that get there? All right, well, we'll talk about that. Those are just a few species that are in Lake Simcoe. And I really want to make it clear that we don't want to give the impression that because there are species here already that it's not a big deal. There are lots of species that are not in Lake Simcoe yet, even though it does have quite a number of aquatic invasive species. I think it's important to talk about the ones that are there, because it makes it clear that A, we don't want to spread those species to other places, to surrounding areas, and B, we understand the impact that the ones that are here can have, and we really don't want species that are similar to those coming into the system. So we didn't have time today to dive into all the other species that could get here but aren't here yet, but I thought that was just worth pointing out. So the new regulations we're going to be talking about in a minute are, they sort of work with some messaging that we've been talking about for a long time, and that's the clean, drain, dry message. So we want to just outline it quick here, and then we'll get into those regulations. So when we talk to watercraft users, boaters, kayakers, you name it, we really like to drive home this idea that every time you move between a water body, it's really a fantastic idea to clean, meaning physically clean your boat and any subsequent equipment. Just remove whatever is on the surface of the boat. Drain it, so that means draining any standing water by pulling the transom plug, draining live well, lowering the motor, etc. And then drying. And drying is really sort of drying or disinfecting. It would be great if we could get people to dry their vessels for 5 days in direct sunlight at every opportunity, every time they leave a water body, but that's not always practical. So the alternative is, or something you can do on top of that, is washing the vessel with hot water above 50 degrees Celsius or pressurized water between 2,500 and 3,000 psi. which is sort of your standard pressure washer. And all these three things combined just make the chance of accidentally spreading an aquatic invasive species way, way less. It's really, about due diligence. Beyond that, we always like to mention this little thing in the corner here that, if you're an angler, you always have to consider what you're doing with your bait as well, and dispose of them properly. Next slide. All right, so we are now into the regulations. So as I'm sure most of you know, the NDMNRF came out with some new regulations, an amendment to the Invading Species Act 2015 as of January 1st, 2022. And these essentially, like I said, they're quite similar to that clean, drain, dry message in a lot of ways, which is fantastic. So as of January 1st, a person is not allowed, it is illegal to transport watercraft over land unless you've drained away any water holding devices, or open them up or remove them, essentially just reduced the chance there's any standing water in the system. And if they've taken reasonable measures to remove any aquatic plants, animals, or algae from the watercraft and subsequent equipment and trailers, etc. Next slide. Beyond that, it is now law that prior to reaching a launch site for a body of water, the watercraft and subsequent equipment, once again, and vehicle and trailers, must be free of plants, animals, or algae. So they're regulating transportation, they're regulating actually reaching the location, and beyond that, it's now law that no person shall place a watercraft equipment, vehicles, or trailers into any body of water if they have aquatic plants, animals, or algae attached. So they're really covering all their bases, making sure that this is something that's going to be fairly airtight so that people don't accidentally spread these species. All right, next. And as I mentioned before, so that kind of goes along with the clean, drain, dry message, but I really wanted to elaborate on what people could do if they want to go above and beyond, because the new regulations kind of cover the first two steps, the clean and drain steps, but not so much the dry step. And so once again, if you want to go above and beyond, you can dry or disinfect your watercraft, once again, by leaving it in the sunlight for 5 days, by cleaning it from top to bottom with hot water, or by pressure washing it. And then beyond that, especially because we're in Lake Simcoe here, and Lake Simcoe has viral hemorrhagic septicemia, which is a pathogen that can cause significant fish die-offs. And we also encourage people to carry around a 10% household bleach water solution. So you can see the image in the bottom left there of somebody spraying their live well. If you carry that around and spray out your live well after every use, and then flush it out with some clean water, of course, outside of 30 meters from a water body, that's a really effective way of eliminating potential VHS that might be in your live well, and just going that extra mile to make sure we don't create issues in another water body. So yeah, so that's great. And I think I will pass it back off to Brooke.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And fantastic timing, because we're just closing in on the last few slides here, folks. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open up for questions and answers. So, obviously there's a great opportunity here for you folks to ask, us questions. You can ask questions to Brenda Koenig and Jeremy Down with the NDMNRF if you have questions about the new regulations. But before we get to that, and actually I'm going to say that now because I'd like you to start thinking about typing your questions into the Q&A box. There's already some that are queued up here, so I'll get to those in a few minutes. But moving forward, if you folks are looking to do some additional research or learn a little bit more about aquatic or terrestrial invasive species. These are some of the links that you can go to. So this is our website at the top here, invadingspecies.com. You also have our partner organization's website at asiancarp.ca. That's the Invasive Species Center that hosts that. And then you have the USGS, the US Geological Survey, and then edmaps.org, where you can report invasive species to us. And then obviously, we have the ontario.ca website where you can go and look up more information pertinent to the Invasive Species Act. So it's time for that question and answer period. You can give us a call anytime, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, at 1-800-563-7711, which is our hotline. Questions about invasive species, reports of invasive species, feel free to give us a call. Alternatively, you can email us directly. You can email Matthew_Robbins@ofh.org. My email is Brooke_Schreier@ofh.org. So feel free to shoot us a message. Alternatively, if you don't have a question for me nor Matt, but you have a question for the program, feel free to email info@invadingspecies.com. So with that said, I think we'll jump into the Q&A period here. So hopefully Brenda and Jeremy are there and we can jump on in here. So the first question is from Dave Mitchell, and it's, do you think that the invasive species in Lake Simcoe are any threat to lakes further north near Huntsville? So Matt, I'm going to pass it over to you to start.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Most species that have invaded Lake Simcoe, there's no real particular reason that they couldn't do the same for another northern lake. There are certain species like zebra mussel that have requirements in terms of calcium, for instance, that maybe some of the Canadian Shield lakes might not make ideal for the reproduction, but most species, aquatic invasive species, are exactly that because they're resilient and because they're adaptable. So they're a real concern for places like Huntsville. And though, as I'm sure many of us know from personal experience, there's some really fantastic fisheries up that way that we really want to protect. And they maybe don't have such a large system that might have the level of resilience that Lake Simcoe does. So definitely a concern.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. Jerry, I see that you have your hand raised, and I will allow you to speak in just a second. But before that, I just want to go down to Diane's question here. So this is for Brenda and Jeremy. So the question from Diane is, how will the new clean, drain, dry regulations be enforced?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So with any new rules, we often take an approach of trying to increase awareness first where we can. And I think, that will be the approach that will be taken generally. However, there is still the opportunity to place charges where it may be necessary, or people are maybe failing to get the message and are still not compliant. One of the things folks may be interested in is that as of, I think it was January 17th, we now have the ability to ticket for some of the carrier offenses. And there's a range of fines associated with that. But as I say, that's usually when we have new rules, we take the approach where we try to educate people and make them aware first, and resort to other measures if we're not attaining compliance.
Thanks for that, Brenda.
Yeah, thank you. Jeremy, do you have anything to add?
No, and the only thing, just to be clear, that it would be whatever our ministries call these days, Northern Development Mines, conservation officers, that will be enforcing the regulations.
Excellent. Okay, Jerry, I'm going to allow you to talk here. So if you'd like to ask your question. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Jerry.
There's a guy.
Hi.
He's in the hospital now.
Just a second. I'm going to move into a quieter room here.
No worries.
Got some noisy people in here.
I just appreciate you taking the opportunity to ask a question.
Okay. What's that?
I said I appreciate you taking the opportunity to ask a question. So what's your question, Jerry?
Oh, I didn't have a question. I didn't realize I raised my hand. Sorry about that.
No worries. Well, thank you for participating.
Yeah, good to meet you.
All right. Well, then, Alan, hopefully with your hand raised, you have a question. So I'm going to allow you to speak here. I'm going to ask you to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Well, thanks for putting this on, guys. I think it's really important that we all learn something as we go along, because this is a big topic and it's an important topic. So thank you.
Appreciate
Now, we talked just a little bit. I'm from the Jack Lake area, Apsley, Ontario, and we talked a little bit about that enforcement thing. It sounds like it's a little nebulous, which is okay for the first year, but I'm just wondering, how are people going to, how are sports people and people that are moving their boats around going to find these boat washing stations to get their boats clean? Is there any movement by the province to have a grant program that the townships and the cottage associations can take advantage of to get the boat cleaning stations in the right places? That's my question.
That's a great question, Alan. And that being said, Matt, I don't know if you want to take the first stab at that. Alternatively, we can call to Jeremy to see if you have anything to say.
Yeah, well, I'm not aware of anything provincially. I know that North Kawarthas, where you are, Alan, are doing a great job of that, and that there's been some cooperation with the municipality and some of the organizations that, for instance, the Jack Lake Cottagers Association have been working together to make that happen. But you know, I'm not sure that I can say anything about provincial granting or anything like that. But I do want to point out that, you know, at the very least, I always like to direct people to car washes. It would be great if we had boat wash stations at every boat launch, but for the time being, at the very least, I don't want people thinking that they need a boat wash station to do this. You can absolutely clean down your boat effectively with pressure washer at a car wash. But with that said, probably I feel like Jeremy or Brenda may have a better answer from a provincial standpoint.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, Matt. So it's Jeremy, everybody. So I can say definitively right now, there isn't a grant program in the works with related to boat wash stations. We have done some work, and OFH has done some work in the past around piloting boat wash stations. And there was some work done, I believe, in the one of the Kempenfeld Bay launches on Lake Simcoe as well, where they maybe have a permanent one. There's issues with it in terms of vandalism, maintenance. You know, it's hard to operate or to keep a pressure washer at those locations in terms of electrical connections and water connections. So there's a myriad of issues that go with that. And so that is part of the reason why we structured the regulation the way we did, right? So the regulation is asking people to kind of do a basic level of cleaning and removing their drain plugs when they're pulling their watercraft out of the water body. But the idea is really that it has to be clean before it comes back to the water body. So that it's been structured that way to allow people the opportunity to take the watercraft home, as Matt indicated, to take it to a car wash facility, somewhere where they can more effectively clean the watercraft off. I mean, the other reality is there are literally thousands of boat launches in Ontario. So, I mean, financially, I don't think it's necessarily the best approach. The Invasive Species Center up in Sault Ste. Marie, again, they're looking at some piloting in terms of, you know, lakes that are relatively uninvaded at this point. So, for example, up in the far northwest, they've looked at a portable station. So there is interest out there, and there is, you know, some work being done to look at where and what it takes to make them effective. But at this point in time, we're not looking at a broad scale rollout. We're not looking at a grant program for washing stations in the province.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Matt. We have quite the plethora of questions here, and a number of them are relating to how it will be enforced, and then we also have a number of questions related to AIS in general. So right now, I think I will prioritize the questions related to the new regulations, given the fact that we're blessed to have Brenda and Jeremy on with us. So Diane asked, will XX, M, or F officers be traveling lake to lake to enforce, or will they rely on people to report offenders to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of how will the enforcement roll out, we're currently working on some of those finer details in terms of the approach, but typically, you know, a couple things happen. So we do have some priorities identified for enforcement. Right now, one of the things we are talking about is the carrier regulation and, you know, how to roll that out across the province. And from just the part of the conversation that both Matt and Brooke and Jeremy mentioned, we do have a lot of boat launches across the province. So it's, you know, trying to figure out where to spend the effort. The aspect of when people call in tips or information where they suspect a violation is taking place. If most of you are not aware, we do have a tips reporting line, and when those tips are called in, certain information is collected from people if you call into the M&R tips line. So a couple of things happen with that. The tips are triaged and then directed for response in the local area where the suspected violation is occurring. So all tips are responded to. It may not always mean that someone goes out. It also depends on the timing of the occurrence, and you know, if there is a chance that an officer would be able to encounter the person still there and inspect them. So it is always useful for us to get tips, because sometimes it's a good way of being able to interact with people who either don't understand the rules or maybe deliberately not following them, and responding with the range of responses that we have, which can include anything from education to issuing a warning to issuing a charge.
Thanks, Brenda. That's awesome. Looking at the time, folks, we have about 8 minutes scheduled for this. So we're going to try to go quickly through some of these questions here. But first, before I do that, I want to give a shout out to Bonnie. Bonnie, I see that your Lake Association has set up 2 boat wash stations, and that's fantastic. I think that's kind of building on the conversation that we're having here, in that, you know, due diligence is on all of us, right? Whether NGO, the government, or individuals, private individuals, to take action to try to prevent the spread of AIS. That could be as simple as cleaning, draining, drying your vessel when you're coming off the water, or going to your local municipality, having that conversation, you know, and trying to get something set up so you can get boat wash stations at the launches. And obviously Bonnie and her crew at the Lake St. Peter Property Owners Association have done that, and that's fantastic. That being said, I want to ask a question from Walter here. So when is one to clean their vessel? Prior to in or right after out? So what he's asking is, when you're leaving the water, you have to clean right away, or can you transport it and then prior to going into the next water body, clean then? So I think I'll pass that question over to Jeremy.
Yeah, so the idea is that when you're pulling the watercraft out of the water body, you're taking reasonable steps. So, you know, do what you can at that point in time to remove as much aquatic, you know, the vegetation, the plants, et cetera, that you can. But we've structured it that way because we recognize there's going to be scenarios where, you know, it's not practical to get every piece of weed off your boat, whether it's, you know, a health and safety issue, a storm blows in, it's dark, you know, busy launches with multiple people lined up to get in and out. So that's the idea, that it's do what's reasonable in your circumstance to clean the boat as effectively as you can. Same thing applies like at the end of the season when cottage boats are being taken out. Often they have a lot of algae on the hull. Zebra mussels can be attached to the hull, and it's not typically easy to clean those things off the boat launch. So the rule is that before that boat is brought back to a boat launch location or is placed in the water, it has to be clean. So fundamentally, it must be clean before it goes back to the lake. So I mean, when you're pulling it out, it's do what's practical or reasonable, but it has to be clean before it goes back in. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And just as another aside, I saw some questions about the availability of brochures or pamphlets. Yes, we have literally thousands. That's, you know, one of our primary tasks is to try to get resources to all members of the public. So if you'd like to communicate with us, you can either email Matt or myself. Unfortunately, my email is not on the slide there. But if you want to email Matt, because I'll make you do the work, Matt. If you want to email him and request some resources, that's fantastic. You can find the majority of our resources on invadingspecies.com underneath the resources tab, where you can either download them, print them out yourself, or just look at them and then get a sense of what you want, and then get in touch with us and let us know, because we'll ship that to you free of charge. That being said, another important thing to mention is that we are in the process of updating our clean, drain, dry signage. So you might be able to see this sign right here behind me. And that is our aluminum sign, which we distribute kind of all across the province. So if you have a boat launch and you want to get a sign up, please let us know. We can get a sign in your hands. There will be some updated wording coming along. So there may be a slight delay because we will be printing new signs to reflect the regulations. But certainly get in touch with us to request resources and signage. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also if just send us an email. And also if by the end of today, we maybe haven't been able to answer your question or missed something because we are running out of time, just write down our emails or my email and send us a message. We'll be happy to go over it.
Yeah, because I'm seeing a lot of questions here where I would take like 10 minutes to respond. So based on the nature of the question, a really funny one, which I'm going to answer really quickly, is from Roy. Roy asked, are these snails edible? And of course, he's talking about the banded and Chinese mystery snails. And Matt and I have had extensive conversations about this. And I know, Brenda, you got in on this conversation as well. You have to be very careful when you talk about eating things like snails. You know, snails do fall under fish under the Federal Fisheries Act. Thus, it's quite a challenge for you to legally transport them across land. That being said, you know, the Chinese mystery snail, we have heard anecdotally, but also historically that they're quite edible. They were actually originally brought in the 1890s and first found in San Francisco and in a food market. But then were subsequently found in the San Francisco harbor the next year. So somebody brought them in for food, somebody introduced them to San Francisco harbor, and then over the course of the next 130 years, have kind of spread all across North America. Banded mystery snail, not so much. Chinese mystery snail, I have heard, are quite edible. And I would dare even say they're probably kind of like escargot or something to that effect. So sorry, that was a funny question I wanted to answer. Beyond that, you know, there are some additional questions around what the types of fines will be, and you know, so what fines people are looking at if they're found to be in contravention of this regulation. Jeremy, Brenda, I don't know if you know specifics or if you can share specifics, but I don't know if you can address that a little bit.
Yeah, sorry. So this is me not knowing my homework, but yeah, so we have established set fines for the reg, and I can't remember the exact amounts off the top of my head here. I was just trying to look them up quickly on Google.
Jeremy, I think Mark Robbins gave us the answer here.
Does he have it?
It looks like $100 for transport over land and $350 for returning it to the water.
Oh, see, I should have went with my memory because that's exactly what I was going to say. But yeah, so everything's listed. So the set fines took effect along with the regulation. So there would be fines in place, and they're structured in terms of the level of risk associated with the activity. So the risks are higher for the boats that are showing up at the launch or being placed in the water versus if you're not taking those reasonable steps on the way out.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Mark, for looking that up and telling that to us. Okay, so another question related to the regulations from Jeff Dano. Does this mean you have to clean, drain, dry your vessel if you fish more than one lake in the same day, even if the lakes are in the same local area? For example, bass fishing in multiple lakes in the same day within a provincial park. I think I can answer that one. You know, Jeremy, Brenda, you know, you can feel free to hop in here. But yes, the answer is going to be yes. If you're going across land whatsoever, you're going to have to be conducting clean, drain based on the regulations. And really, like Jeremy said, it's due diligence. It's going to be ensuring that you're just doing your part to do that visual inspection, remove any plants, animals, or algae, and then just make sure you're draining any standing water, right? To make sure that you're not transporting potentially species from one lake to the next. Because I've heard of circumstances where an invasive species in one lake is separated by a few feet from another lake on the other side where they don't have that invasive species. So sometimes those distances can be very small. So even transporting from one lake in the same region to another could easily transport an aquatic invasive species. So thanks, Jeff. That being said, folks, looking at the time here, looks like we're pretty well at the 8 o'clock hour. So I really want to extend another thank you to Jeremy and Brenda, as well as Matt for giving us a great presentation on aquatic invasive species. I know we've said this once, we'll say it again. You know, if you have any questions, I know there's lots here. Again, I wish I could answer them all. Please email us. Alternatively, you can email the program, you can email Matt or myself. Again, mine's Brooke_Schreier@olfh.org. You can give us a call if you'd like to chat with us. But again, thank you. And if Jeremy or Brenda, if there's anything that you'd like to say, feel free.
Just wanted to say thanks again for involving us, and it's great to see so much interest and that people are wanting to learn about these rules and have some really poignant questions. So thanks again.
Yeah, fantastic. And guys, we had about 107 people tonight. So thank you all so much for tuning in and for giving us an hour of your Thursday evening. I think it's Thursday.
Great turnout. Thanks so much, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody.